Welcome to the lecture on listening pedagogy, which is recorded for the Master Program Year 2 Vakdidactiek. My name is Maartje Visser. The topics we are going to talk about today are why is listening important, what is listening, which sub-skills are part of listening, and what does a good listening lesson look like. We are going to focus on ascertaining the listening level, ascertaining the need for differentiated listening training, creating a differentiated group plan, and creating a differentiated listening lesson. So first, focus on why is listening important. Basically, listening is important because listening is part of good communication. Mendelssohn found out in his research that of the total communication time, about 40 to 50% is spent listening, while only 25 to 30% is spent speaking, and about 11 to 16% is spent reading, while only 9% is spent writing. So you can immediately gather from that is really important to focus on promoting good listening skills, which is really important, especially for second language learners. So why is this important for second language learners? Well, first of all, listening provides vital comprehensible input. As you are aware, I'm sure, Krashen in his research has focused a lot on the importance of comprehensible input, because without comprehensible input, learners will not be exposed to the target language, and exposure is important for developing second language, because you need to notice the language before you can produce it. Michael Showett-Smith has done additional research into the noticing of language features, and he said that by having comprehensible input and being able to respond with pushed output, you actually notice which elements in your own language are missing. So it's vital for language development. And we know from research into sounds that perception is the basis of production, and without actually being able to notice the difference in the target language sounds, you will not be able to produce these sounds. You need to notice them first. So let's have a look at what listening actually is. First, let's start off with some of the characteristics of listening. Listening is basically speech encoded in the form of sound. It is linear, actually real time, with no chance for review, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. Speech is linguistically different from written language, and it's also important to have a look at what is different about the speech. For those who are keen in actually reading up on this, there is suggested further reading, a book by Bach on assessing listening, and I recommend that you read chapter 1. Let's have a look at in more detail. Basically, speech is encoded in the form of sound, and because words are strung together in sentences, a lot of phonological modification occurs. Sometimes it can be difficult for listeners to decipher individual words and the meaning of individual words. In that respect, the context of the listening text helps listeners decipher what is meant. Compare, for instance, I wish you would, I wish you would. Basically, the pronunciation is similar, but the meaning is different, and the context is important to help the listener decipher which particular meaning is meant in this situation. Stress and intonation are also important parts of speech, because speakers tend to stress those things that are important. Training your learners to listen for stressed parts, and using prosodic characteristics, sentence melody, to decipher the message is a really important part of training them in becoming good listeners. Another part of speech that is important to listening is that speech is linear. It is real time with little or no chance for review, unless, as we do, use recording devices to actually rewind and re-listen. Speech is incredibly fast. Native speaker conversations take about 210 words per minute or 3 words per second. And fortunately, there is a lot of redundancy in speaking. A lot of key information is repeated and rephrased. But this heavily relies on the presumptions the speaker has as to the shared knowledge. When the speakers in a situation have a lot of shared knowledge, there will be a lot less redundancy, and speakers will rely heavily on shared knowledge and leave out important information. Linguistic knowledge is required to use up that, to back up that missing information. So if speech is done very fast and there is not a lot of redundancy, the listener needs to bring a lot of linguistic knowledge to the listening situation in order to fill in the gaps. This speed, this lack of redundancy requires a lot of automatic processing. Those listeners with less experience in the target language, the L2, will need to bring a lot more controlled processing to the listening situation, and they tend to focus a lot on the words, the lexis, and the grammar of the message. Whereas learners with a lot of target language experience will be able to work a lot with automatic processing. Let's have a look at the third characteristic. Speech is linguistically different from the written language. It's basically made up of idea units with a coherent intonation marked by a pause or a hesitation. If you look at speech versus written language, then speech contains shorter units, whereas written communication has more dense, longer units. Speech has simple connectors and but, whereas written language has more complex connectors. Speech has a lot of hesitations and repairs, whereas written language has more complete sentences. Speech is much more informal and colloquial, whereas written language is more formal and contains more standard language. And speech is a lot more personal and contains emotional reflections such as I think or I feel, whereas written language is a lot more formal. Again, if you want to read more, consult Buck Chapter 1. This is the end of the first part of this lecture. You can click on the second part to continue.